sold by her aunt for a single sack of flour. A cowboy filled the pantry and gave her a sealed door. The bolt was wrong. That's what I noticed first, not the girl. The bolt on the smokehouse door was turned backward, hasp facing in instead of out, and I'd built that smokehouse myself 7 years prior, so I knew exactly how wrong that was. Hasp faces out so a man can latch it from the outside. Turn it in and you can only latch it from inside. Only reason you'd do that is if you wanted something locked in, not locked out. I was riding the creek fence that morning, late October, frost still on the north sides of the fence posts. My land runs along Cutter Creek for about 2 miles before it bends east into the Harlan Spread, and I was checking for downed wire after the wind we'd had. Wasn't paying any particular attention to the Harlan place until I saw that smokehouse door. It sat just over the property line, maybe 40 yards off my fence, and the hasp was turned wrong, and there was a thin curl of wood smoke coming from the gap at the bottom of the door. I sat my horse for a while. Old Cass, she'd turned 14 that spring, and she wasn't given to fidgeting, so we just stood there in the cold and I looked at that door. Harlan himself had been dead 2 winters. Billy Harlan, rough man, not a neighbor I'd call fond of, he drank, and he let his fences go, and every spring there were 2 or 3 of his cattle in my north pasture that I had to push back. But he was dead now, and his wife Della had been running the place since, and I didn't know Della Harlan except to nod at in Gideon's dry goods. Thin woman. Always looked a little pinched about the mouth. I rode back to my place, pulled the fence tools, went home for dinner, but I kept thinking about that bolt. I'd ridden that fence line more times than I could count. Summer droughts, spring floods, the winter of '83 when the snow was waist-high on a mounted man, and I was out there with my horse half buried, checking wire. I knew every post, every sag, every place the creek had undercut the bank and left a stretch of fence hanging in air. I knew that smokehouse as well as I knew my own barn. I'd built it for Billy Harlan in '79 as a favor. He'd helped me roof my house the year before, back when we were on better terms, and I'd been proud of it. Good tight construction, cedar shingles, proper ventilation slots cut high on the south wall. A smokehouse that faced out the way a proper structure faces, with a hasp that worked right. Now that hasp was wrong, and there was smoke coming from the bottom gap. 3 days later, I had occasion to go into town for nails and a new cinch ring, passed the Harlan place on the road and slowed without quite meaning to. The smokehouse door was shut. No smoke this time. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Della Harlan used it for something odd. Maybe she'd been smoking a late batch of meat in there and the bolt was just her being particular. Women do things their own way sometimes, and it's not a man's business. Still hasp facing in. I got my nails. Gideon behind the counter was talking the way he does. He talks to fill space, always has, and I let him run a while before I said, casual as I could manage, "You know anything about the Harlan place since Billy went?" He set down his ledger and his face did something careful. Said, "Well, Della's still out there. Got her niece living with her now, I think. Came up from Alderton County." I said, "That right?" He said, "Yeah, young girl. Showed up maybe 6 weeks ago. I've seen her in here once. Quiet, looked," he paused, he said, "looked tired." I bought my nails, rode home. It was already past dark when I got in, and I sat at my own table for a long time with a cup of coffee that went cold, looking at the wall. Now, I want to be plain about something before I go any further. I'm not a man who goes looking for trouble that isn't his. I'd lived on that land since I was 26 years old. I was 51 that October. 25 years of keeping my nose on my side of the fence, and there had been times that cost me, times I stayed quiet when maybe I shouldn't have, and I had my reasons, and I don't apologize for them. A man out here alone does the math. You pick your fights by what you can win and what you can afford to lose. But there are some things that once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. A hasp turned backward. Smoke from the bottom gap. A girl who looked tired. You can sit with those 3 things for 3 days, and then you cannot sit with them anymore. I went back to the Harlan place the next morning. Not skulking, rode right up to the front and tied Cass to the porch rail and knocked. Della Harlan came to the door, and her face, when she saw it was me, went through about 4 things real quick before she settled on something flat and careful. "Morning, Virgil," she said. I said I'd seen her smokehouse bolt was turned around, and I wondered if something was out of place with the hardware, because I'd built that smokehouse and I could fix it free of charge if she needed. She said the smokehouse was fine. I said all right, and I said while I was here I thought I'd introduce myself to her niece. since I was her nearest neighbor and a body ought to know their neighbors. Della Harlan's flat, careful face did something then, not anger exactly, something colder. She said her niece wasn't receiving visitors, said the girl was unwell. I said I was sorry to hear that, and I touched my hat brim and I rode home. I knew then, I think I'd known from the moment I saw the hasp. But a man in my position, 51 years old, one man on one piece of land, no official standing, no badge. A man like that has to be careful about what he does with what he knows. You go charging in without thinking and you make it worse. You go to the law and you find out the law is 60 miles away and won't come out for something like this. You have to think. That evening I saddled Cass again and went around the back way, along the creek, and tied her in the cottonwoods and went the last 100 yards on foot. The smokehouse door was shut and bolted, hasp still backward, still facing in. I stood close enough to put my hand on the wood and I listened. The wind had died and the evening was still enough that sound carried. I stood with my palm flat on the cedar planks, feeling the cold of the wood, and I listened. Breathing, and then very quiet, a sound like someone shifting their weight on a dirt floor. I said low, I'm not with the Harlan woman. I'm your neighbor, Virgil Cade. I'm on the north side of the fence line. Silence, the kind of silence a person makes deliberately. I said, I don't mean you any harm. I'm just going to tell you my name one more time and where I live, and that's all. I told her my name. I told her the creek ran south off my land, and if you followed it and turned east at the big sandstone rock, you'd hit my fence, and from there it was a straight quarter-mile to my barn. I said I left a lantern burning on the gate post every night. I said I'd leave it there and I'd be home. Then I walked back to Cass and rode home and hung a lantern on the gate post. It was the third night before she came. I heard Cass moving in the barn first. The horse had good ears and she was particular about strangers. I pulled on my boots and took the rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because a man my age doesn't walk out into the dark without a rifle. It's just sense. I came around the side of the barn and there she was, standing just inside the gate circle of lantern light, and she was so thin I thought for half a second she was younger than she was. She wasn't. She was maybe 22 or 23. Hard to tell exactly because she was wearing a coat 3 sizes too big and her hair was down and loose like she'd left in a hurry. And her feet were in boots that didn't fit right, too large, the laces wrapped twice to keep them on. She didn't run when she saw me. That told me something. A person who'd been badly enough frightened will run at anything. The fact she didn't run meant she'd made a decision and she was committed to it. She'd walked 3/4 of a mile in the dark in boots that didn't fit, following a creek she didn't know to a stranger's gate. That kind of decision doesn't come from fear. It comes from something harder and clearer than fear. I said Virgil Cade. I said it the same way I'd said it through the door, even and plain. She said, I know. She had a low voice, lower than I expected. She said she sold me. I said, your aunt? She said, yes. She said I came up from Alderton because she wrote me that she needed help with the property. She said when I got here there was a man named Pell, who said I'd been contracted to him. He said my aunt had agreed to it for a season's supplies. He said she'd signed a paper. She looked at me steadily when she said this, like she wanted to be sure I understood exactly what she was telling me. She said, I don't believe the paper is legal. I don't know for certain, but I know I didn't sign it. I stood there in the lantern light holding my rifle loosely at my side, and I thought about a lot of things in a short span of time. I thought about Pell, whom I knew, a supply man out of Dalton Crossing who dealt in a lot of things besides supplies. I thought about Della Harlan's pinched mouth and her careful flat face. I thought about a hasp turned backward. I said, come inside. I said, there's warmth and there's food and nobody is going to touch you. She looked at me for a long moment, not afraid exactly, something more like measuring. Like she'd been measured so many times herself that she'd learned to do it back. I let her look. A man who won't hold still for a woman's measure isn't worth trusting, and I'd rather she knew that from the first. She came inside. Her name was Nora Voss. She was from a farm town called Bruster in Alderton County, and she'd been a schoolteacher there for 2 years until the school lost its funding, which was why she'd come north when her aunt wrote. She told me this over coffee at my kitchen table, sitting in my spare chair with her hands wrapped around the cup like she was cold down to the bone, which she probably was. She'd been in that smokehouse for most of 2 days when I found her. The Harlan woman had been letting her out mornings to do the heavy chores, water, wood, mucking, and then putting her back. Pell was supposed to come collect her at week's end. I listened to all of this without saying much. I got bread and the rest of a cold venison roast out and put them in front of her, and she ate without apology, which I respected. A person who apologizes for being hungry hasn't been hungry enough times to know that hunger isn't a character fault. She'd been hungry, and she ate what was put in front of her, and that was the right thing to do. When she was done, she looked up and said, "I don't have any money to pay you. I have nothing except what I came with, which is a bag with a change of clothes and a few books." I said, "I didn't ask you for anything." She said, "I know, why?" "It's a fair question. I thought about it honestly. I said, because it's the right thing and because I can. I said, that's enough reason." She was quiet a while, then she said, "What happens now?" I said, "Tonight you sleep in the spare room with a bolt on the inside of the door. I'll put one on first thing in the morning. She'd have a proper bolt tonight with a chair wedged under the handle. And then we figure out what comes next." I put the chair under the handle of the spare room myself before I went to bed. She watched me do it and didn't say anything, but when I turned to go, she said, "Mr. Cade." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Sleep," and went to my room. I don't know what I expected to feel. Mostly I felt tired. And something else underneath the tired, something that hadn't moved in a long time. I lay in my bed and listened to the house settle and told myself I'd just done what any decent man would do, and there was no more to it than that, and I fell asleep thinking about what I'd say to Hector Baines in the morning. The next morning I rode into town before she was up. I went to see Hector Baines, who was the nearest thing Gideon had to a lawyer. He'd done 2 years of study in Cheyenne before his father died, and he came home, and he knew enough to be useful. I told him what I knew. He chewed on it, and then he said, "A girl contracted against her will, no signature, no court, just a paper between 2 parties. He said, "Pell's done this before." He said the paper wouldn't hold if she contested it, and there was a witness to her not consenting. I said, "I'm the witness." He looked at me over his glasses. He said, "You know, Pell's not going to just accept that." I said, "I know." He said, "He'll come to your place." I said, "Yes, he will." He said, "And what then?" I said, "And then we'll see who backs down." Hector looked at me a good while longer. He said, "Virgil, you're not a young man." I said, "No, I'm not, and I know where everything is on my own land in the dark and Pell doesn't, and that counts for something." He thought about that, and then he wrote out a statement on paper, a proper one, with the date and what Nora had told me and my name as witness. And I signed it, and he kept a copy, and I took a copy. That piece of paper cost me 50 cents, and it was the best 50 cents I'd spent in 20 years. I got back to the place around mid-morning. Nora was up. She'd made coffee and swept the kitchen floor without being asked, and when I came in, she looked at the paper in my hand with those measuring eyes. I put it on the table and told her what Hector had said. I told her the paper Pell had wasn't worth much if she stood up against it, and I stood beside her. I said it wasn't a sure thing, and I wasn't going to pretend it was. I said Pell was the kind of man who didn't like being told no. She read the statement Hector had written. She read it twice. Then she set it down flat on the table with both hands like she was pressing it into the wood, and she said, "I'm not going back." I said, "No, you're not." She said, "And if he comes?" I said, "Then he comes, and he finds out what the ground is like here." She looked up at me. Those eyes, brown, very level. She said, "You're not afraid of him." I thought about that. I said, "I've been the only man on this land for a long time, and I've had harder problems than Ellis Pell." I said, "Fear's useful when it makes you careful and useless when it makes you stop. Right now I'm being careful." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I can work." She said, "I can cook and I can keep accounts, and I was a schoolteacher. I know arithmetic and letters." She said, "I'm not asking for charity. I want to work for what I take." I said, "All right." She said, "And I want my own door, with a bolt that faces the right direction." That surprised me enough that I almost smiled. I said, "The spare room has a window looks east. Good morning light." She said, "That'll do." I put the bolt on that afternoon. Proper iron bolt, hasp facing in so she could lock it herself from inside. She watched me drive the screws home, and I could feel her watching, and when I was done and I opened and closed the bolt a couple of times to show her it ran smooth, she put her hand out and worked it herself. It made a clean, solid sound. She said, "Good." There was something in that one word that I'm not sure I can explain. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was more like, A woman who has been measuring everything for a long time, measuring whether to trust and whether to stay, coming to a first small conclusion. That bolt was a fact. Not a promise, a fact, and she respected a fact. I understood that about her from that moment. I didn't know what it meant yet in the larger sense. I didn't let myself think about it too much. I had a problem to deal with first. Pell came on the 5th day. I won't pretend I hadn't been watching for him. I had. Every morning I was up before light, and every evening I didn't go to bed until the place was checked. Not because I was jumpy, I wasn't, but because I was thinking ahead, the way you do when you know a thing is coming. You think about where a man would come from, which direction the sun would be in, where you'd want to be standing. You think about what you'd say first and what you'd say after and what you'd do if the words didn't work. A man who's worked alone on a piece of land for 25 years knows how to think like that. The land teaches it to you. Nora knew too. She didn't ask about it again, but she was up early those mornings and she kept herself busy and she watched the road. And once I caught her looking at the rifle by the door with a look on her face that wasn't afraid but was something else. Something like readiness, like she was filing it away as an option. I didn't say anything about that. He came in the middle of the afternoon, which surprised me a little. I'd figured him for a night man. He had 2 riders with him, which surprised me less. He rode up to the house like he owned the road and pulled up in the yard and called my name. I came out on the porch. Rifle wasn't in my hands, it was inside, leaning on the doorframe where I could reach it in 2 steps. But I had the Colt on my hip and he could see that plain enough. I said, Pell. He said, you've got something of mine. I said, I've got a woman who came to my gate of her own free will and told me she was being held without consent. And I've got a statement signed and witnessed and held by Hector Baines in town that says exactly that. I said, whatever paper you've got, it's not worth writing out here over. He said, that paper's legal. I said, maybe. I said, but Hector figures it won't hold in any court where she says no, and I say she said no. I said, you could test that. Or you could cut your losses and ride back to Dalton Crossing. He looked at me for a long time. His 2 riders were behind him, and they were looking at me too, and I was aware of all 3 of them with the kind of awareness that doesn't think, that just settles into the body and gets quiet and waits. I'd had that awareness before. In younger years, more times than I like to remember. It's a particular stillness. Not calm exactly, more like everything sharpening. Pell was calculating. I could see it in the way his eyes moved, weighing what he'd lose against what it would cost him to take it. That's the only arithmetic a man like Pell does. Then Pell said, the Harlan woman took those supplies. I said, that's between you and the Harlan woman. He said, she can't pay it back. I said, then you've got a problem with Della Harlan. He didn't like that. A man like Pell doesn't like being told to go deal with the person who actually owes him instead of taking the easier thing. He sat his horse and his jaw worked, and I watched him, and I didn't move, and I didn't say anything else. And after a good long while he reined around and his 2 riders followed him out of the yard. I stood on the porch until they were off the property and past the first bend. Then I went inside. Nora was standing at the kitchen window. She'd watched the whole thing from behind the curtain. Her face was careful again, that measuring look, but underneath it something that wasn't quite settled yet. Something that was starting to settle but hadn't finished. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down. She came and sat across from me. She said, that's it, he just leaves. I said, probably. Men like Pell don't fight wars they can't win cheap. He came out here to see if I'd fold. I didn't. Now he has to decide if he wants to pay more to get something he's already losing or cut and go find easier work. I said, he'll go find easier work. She said, and if he comes back. I said, then he comes back and it goes harder for him. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she said, and this was the first time I heard something in her voice that wasn't level, that had something rougher in it, something that cost her to say, she said, my aunt sold me for supplies. A sack of flour and some salt pork and a box of cartridges. She looked up at me. She said, I've been trying to figure out how to feel about that, and I haven't managed it yet. I said, you don't have to feel anything about it right now. She said, she's my blood. I said, some blood isn't worth much. She was quiet for a long time. She turned the coffee cup in her hands, around and around slowly, the way you do when your hands need something to hold while your mind works. Then she said, you filled a whole pantry for me. She wasn't talking about supplies. I understood that. She said you didn't have to do any of it. I said I had the room and I had the space. I said the land was starting to feel pretty empty anyway. That was more than I'd meant to say. She heard it, I could tell she heard it, but she didn't press on it. She just looked at me straight on, that level brown look, and I felt, I won't dress it up, I felt seen. Plain and direct. Not sentimentalized, not pitied. Seen the way a man wants to be seen, where the looking doesn't flinch and doesn't add anything that isn't there, just takes what's there as it is. She said, I want to stay, if that's all right with you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that's also true, but because she paused, because this feels like the right ground. I said, all right. And that was that. I want to say a word about the winter, because the winter is where I actually learned who she was. She worked, Lord, she worked. Not to prove anything, that was the thing. She wasn't working to justify her place here or to pay some debt. She worked because she was a woman who'd been still for too long, and she had a lot of motion in her, and now she could let it out. She took over the accounts in November, and she had better numbers than I'd kept in 3 years. She found a double billing from the Gideon store going back 18 months, $22, and walked into town and got it corrected without asking me first, and just put the $22 on my desk that evening like it was nothing. She started mending the tack, took apart the whole harness, cleaned and oiled every piece, put it back better than it had been. She started on the barn roof in December on the clear, cold days, and I came home one afternoon, and she was up there with a bucket of pitch, and she didn't ask, and she didn't explain, just kept working. I watched all of this. I didn't say much because she didn't need me to say much, and I've never been a man who talks to fill space. But I watched. The town noticed eventually. Towns always do. A strange woman at the old Cade place, riding in with him on supply runs, standing in Gideon's going over the list with a pencil like she owned the account. There was talk. I knew there was talk because Gideon had a look he got when he was deciding whether to tell you something and had decided against it. I didn't ask him what people were saying. I didn't particularly care. A man who spent 25 years building something on his own terms doesn't start consulting the town about his decisions at 51. What I cared about was simpler. She was capable and she was good and she was here of her own choosing, and I would put myself between her and anything that thought otherwise. That wasn't complicated. That was just what you did. One afternoon in late November, Amos Riley rode over from the Double R with an excuse about a strayed heifer that had never come up before in 30 years of being neighbors. He stayed long enough to get a look at Nora, who was in the yard splitting kindling and didn't stop splitting kindling when he rode up, just glanced over and went back to work. Riley said something half clever that I didn't quite catch, and I looked at him steadily until he ran down, and then I said, I'll watch for that heifer. He rode out. Nora split kindling. When Riley was off the property, she said, without looking up, that one's been out here 3 times. I said, I know. She split another piece of kindling cleanly down the center. She said, does it bother you? I said, no. She looked up at me then, briefly. She said, good, and went back to the wood. Later that week, Gideon finally told me, said some people were saying I'd taken a woman in under questionable circumstances. Said some people were saying Pell had a legal paper. I listened to all of it. Then I told Gideon that Hector Baines had the original statement, dated and signed, and that Pell had ridden off my property without a fight and hadn't been back, and that if anyone wanted to test the legal question, they were welcome to talk to Hector. Gideon wrote that down on the back of a receipt, and I didn't ask why. He was a useful man in his way. That was the end of the town's opinion on the matter, as far as I heard it. By December, nobody rode out with excuses. By January, people were just letting me buy my supplies and going on. In January, there was a bad storm. 3 days of it, the kind that piles snow to the window ledge and makes the horses anxious. We were inside together for 3 days, and I found out she read in the evenings always. She had 4 books in that bag of hers, battered things, and she read them over and over like each time she found something new. I found out she had strong opinions about everything from soil amendment to scripture, and she'd state them plain and not back down from them just because I looked at her sideways. I found out she could make biscuits out of almost nothing, that she hummed to herself when she thought no one could hear, and that she went quiet when she was tired in a particular way, not sullen, just inward, like the lamp turned low. I learned to read that quiet like I learned to read the weather. One evening of the storm, she said, tell me about the land, how long you've had it. I looked at her sideways. She said, I mean it. I want to know what I'm on. So I told her. I told her about riding out here in the spring of '64 with nothing but a horse and a staked claim from a government office that didn't really know what it was staking. I told her about the first winter alone, how the cold got into the house through every gap, and I stuffed rags in the worst of them and burned almost all my wood by February, and went 3 weeks in March burning fence posts to survive. I told her about the summer I lost most of the herd to a fever that moved through the valley and killed cattle on 4 ranches in 2 weeks. I told her about building the barn and the smokehouse and the root cellar, all alone, post by post and plank by plank, because I couldn't afford hired hands. I told her about Ruth, some of it, how she'd come out here bright and willing, and how the second winter had been too much, and she'd gotten sick, and how she died in April with the snow still on the ground. I told her the land had stayed even when everything else had gone. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "That's a lot of years to hold a thing alone." I said, "It is." She said, "You held it, though." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm glad you did." I didn't say anything to that. The fire was low, and the storm outside was making the house creak, and her face in the firelight was attentive and still, and I felt the weight of those 25 years differently than I had before, not as a burden exactly, but as a thing I'd carried long enough that its weight was part of me, and here was a woman who understood that without asking me to explain it. I found out she didn't sleep well the first 2 weeks. I could hear her moving around in there in the small hours. And then somewhere in January she started sleeping long and quiet, and some mornings she was up before me and some mornings she wasn't, and neither of those things was a problem. It was February before I let myself think plainly about what was happening. I'm not a young man. I was 51 that winter, and I'd been alone since my wife Ruth died in '81, 9 years prior, and I had settled into the shape of alone the way a man does, the way it gets into your habits and your daily patterns and you stop noticing the weight of it because it's just always there. I had stopped expecting anything different. That's not self-pity. That's just being realistic. Some men get second things and some don't, and I had stopped counting on being one of the ones who did. The land was enough. The work was enough. I had my health and I had my cattle, and I had 25 years of fences I'd built and fixed and rebuilt, and that was a life, a real one, and I'd made my peace with its particular shape. Then this woman was in my kitchen every morning, and she looked at me with those level eyes, and she fixed my harness and corrected my accounts and argued with me about the best way to bank a winter pasture. And one evening in February, she was reading by the stove, and I was oiling my saddle, and the lamp was low, and the stove was warm, and the snow outside was making that particular sound it makes, that weight on the roof sound. And I looked up, and she was already looking at me. Not at the book, at me. And she didn't look away. I went back to the saddle, but my hands had stopped moving, and I sat there with the rag in my hand for a while before they started again. That was February. In March, one of the Harlan cattle came through the fence again. Old habit of the Harlan stock, predated Billy and would probably outlast all of us. I went to push it back, and while I was mending the wire, I could see the Harlan house at a distance, and I could see Della Harlan hanging laundry, and I thought about stopping. I thought about it a long time while I worked the wire. I didn't stop. What was there to say to a person like that? She'd sold her own blood for a sack of flour and some salt pork, and she'd put the girl in a smokehouse with the hasp turned backward and waited for a man like Pell to come collect. There were things I could say to a person like that. None of them would change what she was, and none of them would make what she'd done undone. I came home, and Nora was at the kitchen table with the accounts, and she looked up and said, "The Harlan cow again." I said, "Yes." She said, "What you do with it?" I said, "Pushed it back." Said Della Harlan was hanging laundry. I said I didn't stop. She put her pen down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want her to have any," she paused, "any power over what happens here, over how I feel about this place." I said, "All right." She said she took something from me, but she didn't keep it. Do you understand what I mean? I said I did. She said, "This is mine now." She said it quietly, not with heat, just as a statement of fact. "This place, this ground," she said, "I earned it. Not from you, you've been nothing but fair, Virgil, but from what she did to me and from what I did after, coming here, staying." She said, "It's mine." I said, "Yes, it is." She looked at me for a moment with those eyes. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a while. I can't tell you what I felt exactly. Something that had been sitting heavy in me for 9 years was sitting lighter. Like a fence post that's been leaning wrong for so long you've stopped noticing, and then someone puts a hand on it and straightens it, and the straightness feels strange and right at the same time. I'd built this land and worked it and held it alone for a long time, and now there was a woman at my kitchen table who called it hers, and she was right to call it that, and the land was better for it. April came slow and wet that year. The creek ran high for 3 weeks and I had 2 stretches of fence go down, and one of the younger horses got into some bad water, and I was running hard for most of the month, up before light and in after dark. Nora kept the house and the accounts, and twice she came out to help me on the fence, didn't ask, just came out with the tools, and we worked a 1/4 mile of wire in cold rain and didn't say much, and it was fine. It was better than fine. There's something about working alongside a person who knows what they're doing and doesn't need to be told twice. You find your rhythm. You stop talking and you just work, and the work gets done. One evening toward the end of April, when the creek had gone back down and the fence was mended and the horse was right again, I was sitting on the porch after supper. She came out and sat in the other chair. We'd started doing that on evenings that weren't too cold, just sitting, looking at the land coming back after winter. The cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves, that particular pale yellow-green they get before they go full, and the light was long and low, and turning that color that happens in late April when the air is still cold, but the angle of the sun is warm, and the creek was audible from where we sat, lower now but still moving. She said, "I got a letter from a school in Morrow County. They need a teacher." The letter was forwarded from Brewster, must have been following me around. I didn't say anything right away. She said I wrote back and told them I was placed. I looked over at her. She was looking at the cottonwoods. She said, "I told them I had a situation here and I wasn't available." I said, "Nora." She said, "I know what I want." She said it without looking at me, plain as she said everything. She said, "I wanted you to know I chose it, not because I had nowhere else to go. I told you that in the fall and it's still true, but I wanted you to hear that I chose." I had my hat on my knee, turning the brim the way I do when I'm thinking, and I made myself stop turning it, and I looked at her profile in that long April light, and she was. She was a woman who had been sold for a sack of flour and had walked out of a locked smokehouse in boots that didn't fit and had come to my gate and measured me and decided to stay. And she turned down a schoolteacher job in Morrow County because she had a situation here, because she had chosen. And she was telling me so directly without decoration, and without softening it, and without asking for anything back. I said, "I'd like it if you stayed." She said, "I know." I said, "Is that enough?" She finally looked over at me. And there was something in those brown eyes, not soft. That's not the right word for Nora. She was never soft, something warm and steady, like a lamp that's been burning a long time and is going to keep burning. She said, "It'll do for a start." I put my hat back on my head and looked at the cottonwoods. We sat there as the light went, those first new leaves catching what was left of it, and the creek making its sound down in the cut, and I felt, I don't have a fancy word for it, I felt located, like I knew exactly where I was and exactly what the ground under me was worth. In May, I rode to Gideon's and bought 4 months' worth of supplies, more than I needed for one person, more than I'd bought in a single trip in a long time. Gideon didn't say anything, but he made his list and he was making it longer than usual, and he knew why and he didn't say anything about it. Just added it up and I paid it and loaded the wagon. And as I was leaving he said, "Getting settled in out there, Virgil." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good to hear it." He'd known me 20 years. He knew what those words meant coming from me. He let them stand. I drove home slow. The wagon was heavy and I wasn't in a hurry. The road ran past the Harlan place and I didn't look at it. I looked at my own land when it came into view, the fence lines clean, the barn roof patched, Cass's paddock gate newly hinged, things that were right that hadn't been right before, some of them mine and some of them hers. When I pulled into the yard, she was on the porch. She heard the wagon coming and came out, and she looked at the load with those measuring eyes and she said, "That's a lot of flour." I said I figured we'd need it. She came down off the porch and started helping me unload without another word, and we carried it in together, sacks of flour and sugar and salt, a crate of canned goods, cornmeal, dried beans, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth, a bolt of cotton cloth she'd said once she needed and I'd remembered, and we stacked it in the pantry that had been half empty for years, and when it was full she stood in the doorway of it and looked at it for a while. I was putting the empty wagon away, unhitching the team, and I heard her come out to the barn, her step on the hard-packed dirt of the barn floor. I was working Cass's traces loose, my back to the door, and I felt her presence the way you feel a change in the air. She came over to where I was standing, and she put her hand on my arm, just her hand on my forearm between wrist and elbow, light and steady, the way she did everything, and she looked up at me with that warm lamp look, that steady burning, and she said, "Virgil Cade." She said, "You are a good man." Not "thank you," not "you've been so kind." She said, "You are a good man." Like it was a fact she'd arrived at carefully over time, turning it over the way she turned everything over, and she'd finished turning it, and she was satisfied with what she found, and she wanted me to know it. Like it mattered to her that I knew it. I patted Cass on the neck. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not a man who handles being told true things about himself very gracefully. I'd spent 9 years alone partly because I didn't know what to do with being seen, and she was looking at me, and she wasn't going to stop. She left her hand on my arm for a moment longer. Then she went back inside. I finished with Cass, stood in the barn for a bit in the dark and the smell of horse and hay and old wood, breathing slow. Then I went inside. She was at the stove starting supper, and I sat down at the table, and the pantry door was open, and I could see the full shelves in there, flour and salt and sugar and everything else. And the smell of the supper starting was already in the room, and her back was to me, but I could see the set of her shoulders, easy and sure, the way a person looks when they're somewhere they've decided to be. No brace in it, no waiting. The lamp was lit, and the stove was warm. Outside, the creek was running. Somewhere on the property, I could feel it without looking, all the fence lines were holding. I sat at my table in my house on my land, and I was not alone. And the woman who'd chosen to be here was a good woman, clear-eyed and capable and loyal and willful and worth every single acre she'd decided was hers, and she thought I was a good man. I let myself believe her,